Good evening, everyone. I'm Sean Duval. I'm here to launch 8 Days in July, an extraordinary book by Qaanitah Hunter, Kaveel Singh, and Jeff Wicks, all of whom work for News 24, and all of whom have contributed to this volume about the very disturbing events in July this year when looting, rioting, unrest, it's not quite sure what to call it, possible insurrection, coup attempt, began in KZN and in some parts of Gauteng and carried on for those 8 days, despite pleas from various people that it would stop, despite the intervention of police to some degree and the military. A very disturbing period in our recent history, particularly coming after more than a year of COVID and lockdowns, both of which exacerbated the problems of poverty and so forth in South Africa. And in many ways, it looks like this was the action of some very poor people in terms of the looting and so forth. So I'm here with the authors of this book, of 8 Days in July, with Qaanitah Hunter, with Kaveel Singh, and with Jeff Wicks, all of whom, as I say, wrote different parts of the book, and I think Qaanitah pulled it all together very, very efficiently and very nicely. It's a riveting read, even for those of us who watch these events unfolding. I think that this book takes us right into the heart of it, and also provides some of the analysis that is needed to try and understand what exactly happened, why it happened, how these events actually evolved. So what I would like to do, first of all, is to ask each of the participants here just to take us back to that moment in July. You're all working journalists, and journalists are, very much, we're always, Googling the latest fact or looking at our phones and finding out what's happening or checking our computer screens, getting calls. And I'll go, it's in the order you are in the book. I'll go Qaanitah, Kaveel, and then Jeff, and just ask each of you, what was the moment for you in July? What was the moment really where at the beginning of this series of events, what was the moment for you as a journalist that you began to realize that something unusual, something odd, something very strange and disturbing was beginning to happen?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sean. You would know that by the time July happened, as a political editor, we had already been completely and utterly exhausted by what had come before that. You would know that this sort of started almost last year. In fact, not even towards the end of last year, towards the middle of last year, where Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo had been requesting former President Jacob Zuma to appear before him at the Zondo Commission and answer questions in relation to his role in state capture. And so it was a back and forth. There was a lot of, Zuma-ing, if you like, in the months that preceded to this. But it was very clear by January, February this year that there was an open defiance of the Constitutional Court, and that former President Jacob Zuma would just not care that he defied the highest court in the land. Now, it's quite interesting that even though there was a whole lot of activity, people were trying to convince him. You would know that the something called Nkandla tea parties became very famous in this time. There was this hive of activity. So it was months and months of that. And then that all culminated in the judgment of Justice C.C. Kampepe. And that's when we knew, all right, it's on. But I think that while there had been threats, and we mentioned that in the book, that there had been this long, ominous threats by men who wear, camouflage regalia and call themselves MKMVA, that the country will be brought to a standstill if former President Jacob Zuma is ever jailed. I think that nobody predicted this type of the extent to which it was allowed to happen. Now, the big question that we set out to answer, probably while it was happening, and then afterwards, was the question of how was it allowed to happen, but more importantly, when did they know it's going to happen? Because if intelligence, and I say they, I mean government, the security cluster, the intelligence space, if they did not know that this was meant to happen, or this was going to happen, then there's obviously that speaks to a systemic failure in our security cluster. And so that's what sort of pummeled us towards where we got. And we were laughing earlier, but I had COVID when the unrest was happening, so I was sick in bed trying to coordinate our coverage and do as much as possible. But really, I think it was probably by Saturday night, early Sunday morning, when I realized that this is probably far worse than any of us expected, and that it's going to get far worse.
Okay. Kaveel, what was your experience of the inception, the beginning of this, the 8 days?
Thanks, Sean. I mean, I would say for myself on the ground here in KZN, very soon after the arrest and incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma, things very quickly started to unravel. I mean, I would agree with what Qaanitah is saying. It had been quite exhausting on the ground up to that point. The evening where there was sort of a negotiation and discussion, about the arrest and who was going to effect the arrest, a lot of doubts sort of hanging in the air with who was going to take responsibility for actually arresting former President Jacob Zuma. On that particular night, we were still contemplating whether it would be Westfield Prison, whether it would be escort. And I was camped outside the Westfield Prison on quite a cold winter's night here in Durban. And there were rumblings of, if he's arrested, this is going to happen. There was a very small group of supporters on the ground. And I would say by Friday morning, the early hours of Friday morning, Jeff can also chime in here, but things really started kicking off in different parts of Durban, in KwaMashu, in Umlazi, various parts of the city. We started to find roads being blocked, authorities being moved away. And at that point, there was really a bit of a concern that, this was going to start to snowball. So I would say at the ground level, it was really the Friday, the 9th of July, when things started to look a bit strange. We often go to protests and they most of the time clear up within a few hours. The police get there, they sort of either arrest people or just clear the roadway and remain there. But there was sort of running skirmishes already at that point. I mean, it wasn't as intense as it would become toward the weekend and by the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the following week. But it had certainly, for me, on the Friday, I can recall Friday morning going to Friday afternoon, actually being stoned. The vehicle that I was traveling in, our work vehicle, was being stoned at. And I got stuck in on Koenig and Lovo Highway in a certain part of KwaMashu. And I couldn't get out for quite a few hours. And I had to eventually go through a very difficult sort of back road to make my way into the outskirt parts of the city and make my way back to the central parts. So, I mean, while things really did accelerate the following week, I would say it really kicked off, by that Friday, very early in the Friday morning. There were plumes of smoke and just lots of people really putting up barricades, barriers, stoning vehicles. Very violent behavior began around that period of time in Durban.
Right. Yes, I want to just interject here because I'll come to you in a second, because what Kaveel is saying is very interesting. I mean, as someone who was obviously, for me, obviously following the news, the whole Zuma thing happening, is he going to be arrested? Not. I think there was an expectation in the lead up to that. I mean, one knew there was going to be some kind of trouble, but I don't think, you had MKMVA and Colney House and all these people, shooting their mouths off. My feeling at the time as it was happening was there's going to, if something happens, it's going to be a protest. It's going to be a massive protest. And if the Amabuto people are there, then maybe there's going to be bloodshed. And that's what I think was in the minds of many people who were observing this and reading the news, was that, there would be protest action and possibly a crackdown on that, and that blood would flow. That's what surprised me, was that it was looting. Suddenly there was, it was the shopping centers were being stripped. That was a surprise for me, someone looking at it, someone from the outside. So I don't know for you, Jeff, in Joburg, what the sort of starting point was for you, and what, whether you were also thinking there's going to be protest, but it's looting, or how that sort of happened.
Yeah, well, I think everyone was on tenterhooks around Jacob Zuma's imprisonment and just his delivery to the Escort Correctional Centre. And I mean, as Kaveel rightly said, things began to simmer on Friday. And I think that sort of set the stage for all of the unrest that followed. Is by Friday we could see that this was not normal protest action that we were dealing with. Protest action, by its very definition, is often disorderly and transient. But what we were seeing was simultaneous protest action flaring up in different parts of the city all at once, strategic road closures with involvement of actors in the trucking industry. And I think we could tell at that point that this is not a normal situation that we would be dealing with, especially not a normal situation in line with, as you said, the normal platitudes from the knee houses of this world calling for general shutdowns. Violence escalated rapidly over the weekend. And I mean, for me in Johannesburg, we were on the road first thing on Sunday morning when the Johannesburg CBD was brought to a complete standstill. Cars were dragged through showrooms, and it was protest action again, flaring up in different parts of the city all at once. And that was by design, to stretch law enforcement to its very limit. And I spent most of Sunday up until the early hours of Monday morning in Hillbrow, watching running battles between police and looters, and it was just endless. Because it all follows a similar modus operandi: start looting in one place, close the roads, tie up the law enforcement resources, and then move to another. So it told us then that there was a high level of coordination to this, albeit quite rudimentary. But it was clear it was a strategy to really stretch law enforcement and to force a national shutdown, which it eventually did. Of course, KwaZulu-Natal was the epicenter, and it showcased violence that we didn't see anywhere else. And it was a transition from normal hotbeds of protest action in the townships, and it went to national road closures, and it bled into the suburbs. And really, KwaZulu-Natal ended up being cut off. And we didn't see that in Gauteng to the same degree. But, from Sunday morning, we reported the first death in this protest action. And that would be the first of many, many deaths. So I think the scene was set directly after Jacob Zuma's imprisonment. We could see the writing was on the wall quite early on. And like my colleagues have said, by the time Sunday rolled around, KwaZulu-Natal was cut off. And police had a march stolen on them in Gauteng and elsewhere. And all of that seems to have been quite ordered and intentional.
Right. So do you think, and maybe I can ask you this, Qaanitah, you've done a lot of the analysis of the sort of intelligence reports, the police response, and so forth. I mean, is it possible to, there was a point at which, even the president and people were saying, look, this is coordinated. It became apparent that even though it looked very chaotic, and one couldn't really kind of make the link in a way, I think, as an observer, to say, what is the link between, say, MKMVA saying we're going to, shut down Durban, say, what is the link between that and, 50 kilometers away, people are removing all the food from a supermarket?
Yeah.
So, I mean, is it a matter of there was coordinate? How does the spark sort of jump from one place to the other? I mean, that's what I'm still grappling with in a way.
Yeah.
Because we haven't seen, so many people arrested. We've seen relatively little in a way of the sort of, what must have gone around in a WhatsApp group or whatever to say, Sunday morning we'll be at such and such a shopping center or something. I mean, what is your take on that? How did that come out?
Sean, the looting that you saw was a symptom. It was not the problem. The problem was law enforcement was overrun. So the looting was a natural consequence of that. It was very deliberate attacks because what we establish in the book is three things. Firstly, the capacity of law enforcement was completely denuded, right? It was diminished. Number one.
Yeah.
Number two, there was a perfect storm of competing interests who used the incarceration of former President Jacob Zuma for cover. That's the second thing, right? And we can go into detail about this because you can then draw the link between trucks being burnt on the N3 highway and what we saw in KZN. And then the third part was this bastardization, if you like, or weaponization of real societal fault lines for nefarious political ends, which was ultimately what we saw, the attempt to topple the president of the ANC by people in the ANC, right? And so that is basically the three themes that come together. So when you look at the unrest and you're saying, wow, how is this allowed to happen? Again, it speaks to all three things. The first of which, it speaks to it speaks to the fault lines in society, poverty, inequality, unemployment. South Africa was a tinderbox. We make that argument very succinctly in the book. The second,
yes.
ANC structures well coordinated. It's very easy to tap into the structures. That's why you would see the WhatsApp groups making very clear instructions. Comrades, bring matches, bring petrol, bring, those were the type of messages. And we were able, through the trove of leaked documents that we managed to get our hands of, get a sense into some of the WhatsApp groups and some of the signal groups that we had not seen before. And then the third thing was the breaking down of the criminal justice system. You saw it on minute levels, like just imagine that picture or that imagery of this massive police station in Soweto overlooking the Ndufoya Mall, or what was the other mall?
Maponya Mall.
Yeah, not Maponya Mall, Jabulani Mall. So those two, I mean, these are massive police stations literally shadowing over these malls, and then you had these malls completely ransacked. And so so that was sort of the metaphor of what actually happened, in the sense that police was completely and utterly broken. Now, there's many reasons that we present in the weaving together of the 8 days, but also in the conclusion when we tie things together. The first is the assertion that was made that the people who were at the heart of it probably knew the incapacity of the police at the time. They were, already stretched because of funding issues. We make that point very clearly, and we actually demonstrate how law enforcement has been underfunded systemically for the last while. We also talk about, a presentation made to Parliament where it was conceded that people who were instigating this unrest were actually knew that police resources were thin because everyone was deployed around the time Zuma was, from the time the Kampepe judgment happened to until Zuma was incarcerated. And so there was almost a breath of relief, a sigh of relief when he was incarcerated. Okay, nothing bad happened. And you could see it from the police minister himself, only for it to happen, a day later. And so when you say, how do you coordinate people running and stealing fridges and TVs in the streets of Pietermaritzburg? It's again, it needs to be viewed as that was not the core of the unrest. That was the sort of spillover. Yet the core was the enmeshing of criminality, people with different interests. So if you were your local thug, this was the perfect opportunity for you to organize, to do organized crime, like what we saw with the ATMs, which is just mind blowing, where it was literally organized syndicates cutting up ATMs and withdrawing cash.
I mean, yanked them out the wall, basically. You saw ones where the whole thing had just come out the wall. So obviously there was a lot of it was providing cover for criminality, just in the sense of steal the money, whatever. But what about the question of the attacks on infrastructure? Because that is something that's sort of also a little bit beneath the surface in a way that this was taking place, and this was possibly coordinated by people with some military experience, military background. Did you see that? I don't know, Kaveel and Jeff, whether you saw any of that sort of attacks on infrastructure. I know that some of the infrastructure the police did manage to protect. They did get there in time in a way to sort of protect some of it. But what actually happened with that at the same time as the looting was going on, which you say is a kind of spillover or a symptom? I mean, do you think that the attacks on infrastructure was that they were a core part of the project in a way, a core part of it? Jeff, you're nodding. Maybe you have something to say about that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and it's something that we saw in both provinces, is that, it was, like I mentioned earlier, there was a very distinct modus operandi, which we were, in hindsight, able to take stock of. And it followed as such. These faceless individuals would rush in and set burning tires across the road. And I mean, Kaveel witnessed this happen from a helicopter flying above. Buckies would drive in and unload tires, set them on fire, and then leave. And by that point, the road was closed and law enforcement was hamstrung, and then the looting would begin. But a new facet, which I have never seen before, and I think which has become a hallmark of this unrest, is that it wasn't only looting, but vandalism as well. So that while these shelves were being stripped bare, fires were being set. And we look at the example of Macro in Springfield Park, a massive warehouse was looted to the rafters, and then it was set ablaze, along with all of the shopping complexes which surround it. And I think vandalism was a key trope in this whole thing. And you mentioned attacks on critical infrastructure. The police did manage to step in and intervene in some instances, but in others they did not. You merely need to look at the retail sector to how those shops were completely gutted and then razed by fire. We had an incident in Durban, and Kaveel will attest to this, is there was mobs of looters and rioters attempting to storm the Pavilion shopping mall, which is, iconic of Durban. It's even on the city's seal. And the police spent 12 hours rebuffing these attacks all through the night. And there were similar attacks planned in Gateway, and those too were thwarted. But the reality is, it became a constant theme of this protest, or of this looting and of this violence, rather, that it wasn't only the poor letting loose in a popular uprising. No, the issue was the violence was seeded. And when it took hold, then vandalism took place, and it was a clear agenda to damage infrastructure and inflict maximum damage. And that's why we can look at that figure of 50 billion rand and think it could have been much worse than that. But that was the level of destruction. It's not only the goods that were stolen, but it was the actual buildings, brick and mortar, which were pulled down in this entire 8 days.
Yeah, I think that was one of the surprising things about it as well. You know, you could, on one level, you could sort of understand, well, you know, maybe there's a bunch of people who, you know, Zuma supporters or MKMVA or someone, you know, is trying to cause a whole lot of inconvenience and trouble and so forth. And then there are people who are looting because they're hungry and so forth. They need, you know, they need basic foodstuffs and things, and you could understand that. But as you say, when it got to the point of, then, you know, at some point, they not only looted, they burnt the place to the ground. And as you say, that was kind of a new thing. It's like almost a sort of lust for destruction in a way, of just like, you know, oh, my lights just went out. Welcome to South Africa. You know, that people went so far as to actually, you know, I mean, places were just absolutely gutted. They were just absolute, you know, just total destruction.
Can
Yeah, sorry, Qaanitah, you said?
Just to add on that is that, you know, it's not random that things like ports are attacked. King Shaka International plans to attack King Shaka International Airport. I mean, the last we heard of a planned attack on the Vaal Dam was Boeramach, and now you had planned attacks on the Vaal Dam. You had the same at the JSE. So you were not. I mean, we were, and that's what I implore people reading this book. While yes, you're going to get a bit of the flavor of the looting and what you saw, the TVs and all of that, but there's a bigger picture. You know, to say that it was going to be far worse. It probably also was far worse. And again, points to the fact that when we looked at stuff like the attacks on waterworks plants, for example, or you know, or the nature of the public infrastructure attacks, and that pointed to it coming from people who were trained to overthrow an illegitimate government, gain the freedom that South Africa now enjoys, presided over the intensification, if you like, of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, and then weaponizing that same perils of society for their own purposes. So what we then say is structures like the MKMVA, organizations like the ATDFDSA, is that how you pronounce it, Jeff? Those type of formations coming together with a very targeted agenda. And again, instigators coming from people employed by the state, aided by the failures of law enforcement. So again, the sporadic versus the planned coming together and combusting in what you saw.
Yeah, for me, that's a very, very interesting thing, that sort of particular nexus of how that happens. And I mean, you can see, as you're saying, with organizations like MKMVA, I mean, you know, it's been said before they were involved in the, you know, attacking foreign truck drivers, you know, that kind of thing, and that there's already a kind of overlap beginning to take place between you know, the forces of liberation, let's say, and now 20 years, 25 years into the new South Africa, they've begun to sort of, there's a coalescence taking place between criminal groups, and so their interests are beginning to align. You know, seen a certain amount of that in the taxi industry, one seen it in, as you know, as I say, the sort of trucking and so forth. And it seems to me that at all sorts of different levels of society, this meshing is beginning to take place of sort of or not even beginning. I mean, I think it's fairly far advanced. You know, of people, as you say, you know, trained might have been trained to be saboteurs, in MK, to blow up a power station or something. 25 years later, they're doing it, against, the democratically elected government. And I think that there was some sign of that in, for instance, Kaveel, in the chapters, one of the chapters that you wrote in the book, you talk about the arrival of the premier of KZN, Sihle Zikalala, on the scene and how he reacted. And your description of that, I thought, was very interesting, because it seemed to me to show someone who really didn't know what was going on, or didn't really know how to react. Am I correct in that impression, Kaveel? Is that kind of what you were describing?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, I think you're referring to the Wednesday, the 14th of July, and by that point, the people of eThekwini, KwaZulu-Natal, had really been pretty much overrun. Jeff mentioned earlier sort of sabotage at Springfield Park, different infrastructure points. I can personally tell you that there were so many instances where there were areas that I'd go to where there'd be mass looting, and you'd have a very small group of guys, maybe 5 or 6 people at a time. I mean, he mentioned the helicopter incident. That wasn't just one incident. I also saw that on the ground, and there were many sort of reports of that I received throughout the province, in the North Coast, Northern KZN, all over the province. And in terms of the sort of the Wednesday, the 13th of July or 14th of July, I'm not sure, I think it's the 14th. It was the first time we had seen a real visible sort of presence from the police. And the premier had announced in his WhatsApp group, some of his sort of spokespeople or media people, that he would be going out to stop looters. It was an incredible declaration from the premier, but it also sort of spoke to how distant he was from the ground, because I was on the ground with him at Nandi Drive in Durban, and I can tell you that he was extremely surprised at what he saw. On the same day, he had been caught on camera sort of assaulting a young man out of sheer frustration. I think he'd realized it wasn't a simple solution. It had well and truly sort of gotten out of control. And that was an extremely difficult day, personally for me. Qaanitah knows, Jeff as well. But it was the first time I really got emotional as a journalist, because there was the premier and a lot of sort of people we hadn't seen for days had just come out and was sort of directing police. And most of the police that were there that I spoke to weren't even from KwaZulu-Natal. Most of them were from Johannesburg. And they were like, we're here because your police can't handle this. We don't know where they are. We're just here trying to help out. But this is such an impossible situation. And it was the first time we'd also saw a small presence of the army sort of on the ground. I think they had, at that point, been more at the national key point areas, sort of securing that. So people had been really, where's the police? Where's the police? Because everyone had been patrolling at nights, and trying to sort of protect their communities from rampant looting. And like you're saying, organized crime, opportunistic crime really, really got out of control in the city. So, when the premier did come to the ground, and he was at Nandi Drive, which is one of the most intense parts of the city, we had running skirmishes that entire day, and there were the bodies of 2 young boys underneath that bridge that we were at, and we kept running past them. Ordinarily you'd get like a piece of foil or someone would come take these boys away. They couldn't have been older than 12 or 13 years old. And I mean, while the premier is sort of barking these instructions, underneath you've got these 2 boys that have lost their lives, that apparently overnight they had jumped the bridge because people had stormed the sort of roadway, and they had nowhere to go. And so it was a bit sort of, you're out here on Wednesday, but do you really understand what's happening? And the premier eventually left, when the police, the sort of flying squad, a lot of helicopters started hovering, and they really came in to remove the people that were there, to try and clear the area. The premier had left. He'd seen what was the amount of people that were there, and you could tell he was very overwhelmed. So yeah.
So tell me, in the process of getting this book together, which I thought remarkable fact that you got it together this quickly. I don't know, books can be got together quite quickly, but I think this is quite extraordinary because there's a large amount of information that needed to sort of be squeezed in, that needed to be gone through, that needed to be analyzed, and also to sort of coordinate the different stories, the stories of people on the ground, the stuff that came from Kaveel, the stuff that came from Jeff. And you would imagine that, one quick way to get that together would basically just be to sort of, take it from the news reports and stitch it together. But you didn't do that. You approached it in a sense as a kind of fresh investigation. You started in a sense afresh, and the pieces that Kaveel and that Jeff wrote are very much, they're on the ground reportage, but they're not your sort of quick fire news report. This is what happened. This, boom, 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 facts. There's a great deal of richness of observation in there, and the kind of thing Kaveel is talking about, the bodies of 2, 12, 13-year-old kids that sort of detail and that sort of level of, in a sense, it's a very rich and detailed kind of storytelling. And you said, Qaanitah, that in a sense you sort of, you approached it as a new investigation, or as a sort of, a blank canvas in a way, that you were going to sort of say, okay, let's start at the beginning and let's do this. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how that sort of process worked. 3 different people working on a book. You've all got day jobs, and how that sort of worked, and how you managed to bring that together into the book.
Yeah. So when we got together, we knew 2 things. We didn't know what was awaiting us. We didn't know the mammoth task at hand. I think we were a bit naive, Jeff and Kaveel, not knowing what really was set out for us. But 2 things we decided. The first was we're going to tell it day by day. That was a very important thing. And then the second thing was the brief that we got, that we have to instill some of the personal reflections that we gathered along the way in this book, because it cannot just be the facts. You just heard what Kaveel experienced, what Jeff experienced, and what I did from a distance. But it was important now to marry the 2. And that was the first bit. And then the second bit is obviously the 3 of us coming to the story with 3 different and distinct interests, and then obviously different voices. And what I thought would be a little bit perhaps chaotic came together so eloquently. And I think that our strengths really complemented each other. So whereas I focused on the, if you like, the scoop, Kaveel sort of had the meticulous detail of each day pieced together. Whereas, Jeff had brought this beautiful writing style that I don't think Kaveel and I could have brought to the book. And it was a month of not sleeping. We when I say we did not sleep, we did not sleep. You're overwhelmed. You have to decide what not to write, right? It's really, really overwhelming to say there's so many things happen. How do you do it? And then the second thing for me that I found very difficult was, the action in the book starts by chapter 6 or 7. I wanted it to start by chapter 1, but we had to build up. We had to give that context to someone who doesn't know what happened. So that was quite fascinating. And then what was also interesting is, as a collective voice, write a conclusion. That was for me a really, really amazing experience. All of us bringing different elements, different things to focus on, and then literally we sat and we wrote and we rewrote and we rewrote. Jeff, do you know how many times we rewrote? I've lost count.
Yeah,
well, obviously.
Such a just to sort of expand on what Qaanitah said. I mean, this was the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of South Africans, and when it was happening, I think everyone's world became quite small, and you sort of were overwhelmed by this never-ending cycle of breaking news and new looting reported and more deaths reported, and I think what we set out to do was to give people a bird's eye view of what happened. Not only stitching together what we experienced on the ground, but then also looking deeper and going into state security cluster meetings and finding out who knew what and when they knew it, and whether or not any of this could have been avoided, and exploring sort of the granular detail of how things played out in a retrospective view. And I mean, it's important. This is the largest event that imperiled our democracy since 1994, and it's an unmistakable news event, and it's a historical event that we were all swept up in, and it's an important part of our history. And that's what we set out to do, was to really sort of give people a bird's eye look at what happened, and that will contrast against their own lived experience of what they went through during those 8 days.
Well, I think it's a magnificent piece of work. I think you've really done the job. I think inevitably, given that, as Adrian Basson says in his foreword, it's a rough draft of history. To me, it's amazing that it's not rougher, because I think you managed to smooth some of those edges. And obviously, as time goes by and as things develop, the more questions will be asked, and possibly more information will come out, and hopefully, we will be able to get to a point where, in a way, some of the instigators and the people responsible for lighting this bonfire, are brought to justice, because it was really an extraordinary event, and I think it was something that really, as you say, Jeff, in the history of democracy in South Africa, this was really, so many people involved in basically, tearing their way through, it really a blow to people's lives, and to, the kind of suffering that came out of after that, of, people in lack of supplies, roads blocked, and so forth. It was really a blow to South Africa as a nation, in a way, particularly coming out of COVID and the lockdowns and so forth. And it was quite an extraordinary thing. So I hope that I hope very much that people read the book, and that people think about what's in the book, and that that as time passes, we get closer to coming to understand more of the detail of who was involved, how the spark was lit. We can kind of see the outline now, but there are not that many people really being charged with with this kind of sabotage, this kind of attempted insurrection. So I think there are places to go. There's more to learn, and having sort of read it after having witnessed, I feel that I certainly have a clearer understanding of it, and yet at the same time, I think more to learn. So I certainly hope that people buy the book, and that people read the book, and that people, that people approach beginning to sort of get, as you say, a bird's eye view, but also sort of sense of what it felt like on the ground, because I think that's also very valuable learning experience for people, you know, to kind of see what the impact of this on people's lives were. So with that in mind, I'm going to wrap up there, because apart from having hit 45 minutes, I mean, my lights have gone out, and I think the computer's about to die. So thank you very much for giving us that information. Thank you very much for participating in this discussion. And I hope that that as things go forward, that we do learn from this, and that we learn more. And you know, that hopefully this can be a bit of a learning experience for South Africa, you know, to overcome the pain and trauma. So thank you very much to you all. Thank you very much, Qaanitah, Kaveel, and Jeff, for participating and for talking to us about 8 days in July. To the people who are watching, thank you very much for watching, and we hope that you'll get the book, and that you'll read it, and that it will enrich your experience and your understanding of where we are in South Africa today. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Sean.